I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Grant Newsham, a corporate and governmental advisor and lecturer on Asia-Pacific defense matters and business risks posed by organized crime, money laundering, and political instability. Grant currently serves as Senior Research Fellow at the Japan Forum for Strategic Studies and has prior experience in risk management for Morgan Stanley Japan, security management at Motorola Japan, and U.S. Foreign Service work in Washington, D.C. and Tokyo. Grant retired at the rank of colonel in 2014 following a 30-year career in the United States Marine Corps Reserve and holds a Juris Doctorate from UCLA. So Grant, welcome back. And I want to start out by thanking you for your career of service, both within and outside of government.
Thanks very much. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, so I want to congratulate you for your Fox News appearance yesterday. The title of that was Expert Sounds Alarm on China's Support for Iran as Parliament Moves to Close the Strait of Hormuz. So I wanted to ask what your thoughts were on that TV appearance starting out. What kind of feedback have you had on it so far?
Well, it's actually been very good feedback. I generally tend not to hear from people who don't like what I say. But it was good feedback, and it seemed to come across pretty well. It was a nice short clip. You do wonder, of course, how many New Yorkers are awake at 4:30 in the morning. But I gather there's probably quite a few. But it was, it was good to be able actually to answer a few questions that corrected some of the thinking that goes along, that's going around, and that I see a little bit differently. And I think even the interviewers might have thought about things a little differently than they originally had. But it's an issue, that Straits of Hormuz issue as a subset of the broader issue of China and Iran. It's one that's been around since the 80s. You would remember it as well as I would. The tanker wars in the mid-80s when Iran and Iraq were fighting. The Americans got in to escort tankers to the oil fields and to get them out more or less unscathed. So it's something that it seems like it's always been an issue. And once again, it's come back.
Yeah. Well, there are so many different competing interests in the Middle East, right? And that's kind of what concerns me. There's so many alliances. There are so many countries that have, economic as well as political and military agreements. And so it's one of those things where it's like you pull the string and the whole thing starts to unravel, right? And I think that's the concern with this current conflict with Israel and Iran. But let me bring folks up to speed on the history, just in case they missed any of it. So on June 13th, Israel launched airstrikes against nuclear weapons facilities in Iran, which then responded with rocket attacks targeting civilian population centers in Israel on Friday night. Then on Saturday, the U.S. launched attacks on Iranian nuclear facilities at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. Now, since then, Israel and Iran have exchanged more fire with each other before coming to an abrupt ceasefire last night. So maybe there's a silver lining here. Maybe things are on the right path.
It could be. We've seen some of these things before. One recalls George Bush, declaring mission accomplished. One recalls his father actually ending the Gulf War, the first one, probably 48 hours too soon, because it made a nice tidy soundbite with the 72-hour war. Whereas if he had kept going, he might have had Saddam Hussein leave. He probably would have. And you would probably have avoided many of the problems that we have had since that first Gulf War, as amazing as that is to imagine. So one's always a little bit skeptical when somebody declares peace and that everything's resolved. I would note in this case that the Israelis apparently have gone along with it. I don't know exactly what they think, but that's something that does deserve considerable weight, because they, obviously know the region, and they're the ones right on the front line who've suffered the casualties. But when somebody says 12-day war, it's all good to go, we're going to work things out, well, this is a part of the world where one should be skeptical about what's coming. And I personally, I wonder if we stopped it too soon. Well, that would be my concern.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, right? And so when I read that, the first thought that crossed my mind was, is this a ceasefire because they see this escalation happening and they're worried about things getting out of control and ultimately they want peace? Or is this instead some kind of tool to buy time for their larger ambitions, which may or may not be nuclear, but certainly seem to involve, a long-term pattern of aggression against Israel?
Well, that's where I come down on this. But of course, I'm not the president, and someone else is, and they have access to a lot more information than I do. So I'm always going to give them the benefit of the doubt. And the Israelis, it's not clear if they were sort of encouraged to uh, join the ceasefire, as America does have leverage over the Israelis, and they may have applied it, so they may have gone along unwillingly. I just don't know. But it is something to consider. And here's how I would look at this is uh, what you could find, and you always have to wait a little time for, sort of a little period for time to pass once these wars are ended and see what happens. Because one could imagine a situation where the Iranians just say, no, we're not going to, have peace with anybody. You've attacked us, we're blah, 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 the usual sort of excuses that
Yeah.
we've heard for 45 years. But they could say that and then say, look, well, and then they would say, look, the Israelis have, hammered us with everything they have. And then they got the Americans to come in. And the Americans dropped their biggest bombs except for nuclear weapons. And we're still in power. We took it all. We could handle it. And looks like we won, didn't it? And you're going to find a lot of unease in a lot of the Middle East where countries say, oh my goodness, once again, the Americans, put on a good show and then they stopped. And that could be how this dynamic plays out. It's not as if you haven't heard it before. We've seen it with Al-Qaeda, with the Taliban, with Iraq. And the Israelis experienced it in Lebanon in 2006 when they went down the target list, or 2005, 2006, and they went down the target list, blew up just about everything of interest in the Hezbollah parts of Lebanon. And then the Hezbollah said, okay, what else do you have? Well, at that point, the Israelis were stumped. And it sure looked like, well, Hezbollah came out on top, even if they took a hammering. And say that is it helps to understand a little bit of the sort of psychological dynamic in this part of the world. Yes, they were pounded in a way that would have probably brought us to our knees or to the negotiating table. But if that's not how you look at things, well, okay, we got hit hard and we're in a bad spot, but look at us now. Everyone was in a hurry to make a peace deal with us. And our regime is still in power after 45, 46 years, and nobody could do anything about it. And that's where I have some concerns. Of course, I'm probably a minority view, but I think we've seen this before, and we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah. Well, I hope for peace, right? But it becomes one of those trust but verify situations. Now, in terms of this rapid escalation of hostilities, which was happening over the last couple of weeks, there was a vote on Sunday by Iran's parliament to approve the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. This is a major shipping lane for oil, especially oil flowing from Iran to China. And one of the reasons that I'm so excited to talk to you about this is you have such experience and depth and expertise in terms of China, right? Chinese policy, their politics, their military, their strategy, everything relating to that. And you are actually the author of When China Attacks, which is a book on China's long-term ambitions, I guess, in their part of the world. And so I wanted to take this to you. China initially supported Iran, but it seems that they are toning down their rhetoric and pulling back a little bit, at least in public. So could this threat to their energy supply be part of the reason?
Well, I think that's part of the reason. They get, what the figures vary, but about 50% of China's energy comes from the Middle East. And a good chunk of that comes through the Persian Gulf, through the Straits of Hormuz. And yes, they could probably find a replacement for it, but you really don't want to do that. That would be a huge disruption to China's economy. But part of it also is that the Americans and the Israelis and perhaps the West have the upper hand in this fight. And China is not in a position to intervene militarily. They just don't have what is called the power projection capability, and that means your ability to employ military force quite a ways from your boundaries. They just don't have it yet. For all of the progress the People's Liberation Army has made, and despite their intentions, and they do want to be able to operate globally, they're just not there yet. So if they were to actually weigh in, it would cause some problems for them. But keep in mind that the Chinese do have two electronic intelligence gathering ships in the Persian Gulf. And I think there's said to be another Chinese warship on deployment there. And these things can suck up all sorts of electronic intelligence about where the Israelis, the Americans are, and help with targeting. And I would bet anything that the Chinese are providing that information to the Iranians. And also the Chinese embassy in Tehran is in all likelihood an intelligence gathering and electronic intelligence collection center. They always are. So it's not as if they're standing clear, but they're not in a position really to intervene. So it does show the limits of Chinese power projection capabilities. Also, there's a political aspect to this, is you can see that China's political influence isn't quite what you think it would be, given their economic clout. They're making some platitudinous statements about de-escalating, having peace, and they're blaming everything on the Israelis. And ultimately, though, they have no credibility, and nobody takes them seriously when it comes to sort of brokering a deal or causing the parties to back down. And they don't really have that much coercive power except over Iran. And because the Chinese buy 90% of Iran's oil exports, it is those exports and the funds that come from them that have really helped the Iranian regime survive. So that is some real leverage. China isn't playing it at all, and I don't think they want to. So it's interesting to see once again the limits on China's influence now. But say wait a while and see what happens. If you get into a ceasefire or stalemate where particularly the Iranians are circumventing it, violating it, and the Americans and the Israelis can't quite figure out what to do about it, you could see the Chinese start to fly in, say, missile parts, nuclear components, and all sorts of weaponry as well. They've certainly got the long-range aircraft fleet, like 100 long-range Boeing freighters. Well, you can use those. Thank you, Boeing. And they have some of their own long-range Y-20 aircraft, the equivalent of our C-17. In fact, they're based on stolen C-17 blueprints. So they can do it. And I suspect you might find them get involved in that sort of sanctions busting or in sending in military hardware and technology and necessary equipment. They did it right after the Ukrainian war started. And the administration, of course, hushed it all up. But like everybody on earth knew what the Chinese were doing. So I expect we might see that again, but you have to let it play out. And the Chinese will try to ride this situation as best they can to their advantage and nobody else's. And also, it's a good sign, once again here, example of how the Chinese don't respond well to surprise. And I think they were surprised by the Israeli strike, the success of it, and then even the Americans getting involved. And you'll see it in their response, where it has not been a very sort of strong, thought-out response, but rather, let's not have war. But they will wait and see. They'll gauge things, and I'm sure we'll hear from them in short order.
Well, NBC wrote, Beijing has drawn closer to Iran in recent years, with the two countries cooperating regularly on military exercises and signing a 25-year strategic partnership in economic, military, and security cooperation in 2021. It's also a partner in the Belt and Road Initiative, which the Global Times described as a way to, quote-unquote, counter U.S. hegemony. So these two nations are pretty interconnected, but they are also part of a larger coalition along with Russia and North Korea. And that is something that has kind of been called the axis of evil by various pundits. Now, we've got protesters in Iran right now chanting death to Israel and the USA. China has had similar rhetoric in recent years. So are these regimes propagandizing their citizens towards conflict?
Goodness, with Iran, the death to America, death to Israel, that's almost like the Muzak in an elevator. If they weren't saying it, it wouldn't, you'd say, what's going on here? But that's been their thing for a long time, although there's a lot of Iranians who don't agree with that, who would like a decent country to live normal lives. You saw that in 2010 with the Green Revolution, where you had Iranians in the streets demanding a change after an obviously stolen election. And that was very close to success. It would have just taken really the then U.S. Administration to just put in some verbal support for the protesters, and I think that might have tipped it. Instead, they stayed mute. And in fact, one very senior foreign affairs official who just passed away, so I won't say his name, he even said, Iran's a democracy. And we let that thing wither. But the point is, not all Iranians agree with that. And after 45 years of this indoctrination, you've still got plenty of people who aren't out in the streets. That you can see that the regime has not been as successful as it would like to be, but it remains unchanged in its objectives, which is ultimately to destroy Israel, destroy the United States. There is nothing moderate about this regime. And the Chinese, of course, they've been very clear. The objective has been to drive the United States out of Asia, out of the Pacific, and ultimately to dominate the world. They've been very clear about that. And there's, if readers are interested, you should look up something called Document 9, which is a speech that Xi Jinping gave around 2013. And they lay it out very clearly, what they intend, or just read the English translations of the Chinese press for a week, and they're pretty clear about what they intend. And they do consider themselves as at war with us. Their idea of war is different than ours. But what you have with China, Iran, Russia, North Korea is an alignment of strategic interests. There's some real differences between these countries, these systems, these cultures. But for now, on the big thing, they all align, and you're seeing some meaningful cooperation. This latest business in the Middle East, as I say, has caused them to pull back a little bit, and it's not clear what role Iran will play in this axis of evil, axis of chaos. There's a few different expressions. None of them is axis of good. So that's where we stand today, and it really has been a considerable change just in the last 2 weeks, because Iran seemed to be, just hard to get at, and it was showing that they weren't.
Well, what you're describing really sounds like alliances of convenience rather than long-term mutually beneficial relationships. One of the things that came to mind while I was doing research on this was Iran wants nuclear weapons. Russia, China, and North Korea already have them. All of these nations are targeting the United States. I'm wondering if any of these nations will potentially use them, and why have they not shared them with Iran? Is that a fundamental trust issue? You mentioned that Beijing doesn't like surprises.
Well, the support for nuclear development, it always goes slowly, if you'll watch it. I think China, in particular, always wants to be careful about how it goes about it. So the support it gave to North Korea, it wasn't full bore, but it was enough to allow the North Koreans to develop these weapons. And that goes back into the 90s, when the Americans were convinced that North Korea wasn't going to do anything, that China couldn't possibly want North Korea to have nuclear weapons. But boy, talk about misreading that. But it's what the support was given gradually, and just in certain areas, and sometimes using proxies. Say the North Koreans, for example, have helped the Iranians. The Iranians have helped the North Koreans. The Pakistanis, backed by China, have been involved in all of this. But it comes sort of piecemeal. And Chinese support for the Pakistanis, for example, was like that. It was really bit by bit. And they don't mind, actually, if these people end up with these weapons. I think they see the discomfort, the problems that it causes their main enemy, the Americans and the West, to be worth the risk of having their erstwhile allies with nuclear weapons, but they have gone about it slowly. And you also see if you do it that way, one, you avoid getting caught, or it's harder to pin it on you, but also you draw out the distraction. And in the meantime, China itself has been able to build up its military over the last 20, 30 years in ways that many people thought was impossible. In fact, most people did. So they've bought themselves some time as well. And keep in mind that for all these years, and even now you hear it, in DC and elsewhere, you would hear this expression, we need China's help with fill in the blank. And it was always North Korea, nuclear weapons, transnational crime, climate change, just fill in the blank, even though China has no interest in giving us any help with this. And as a result of this thinking on our part, though, it really handcuffed our ability to move and to operate. And we allowed the People's Republic of China, the Chinese Communist Party, to get away with all sorts of things. I say they have conducted this military buildup, economic buildup, largely funded by us and with much of the technology provided by us without any obstacle, any hindrance, because we needed China's help with fill in the blank, one of those North Korea. That's kind of how we got where we are today. But this article of faith that the Chinese don't want these other countries to have nuclear weapons, I think that's probably a misreading of things. That's how I would see it.
That's important to point out. So I have some potential economic impacts if the Strait of Hormuz closes. I know that I am jumping around. These things are, again, all interconnected. This whole thing started with Iran, developing nuclear weapons. But again, we have made it to this parliamentary vote about the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which may or may not happen, depending on how the ceasefire goes. So global oil and gas prices would potentially surge. 20% of the world's oil, 20 to 25% of liquid natural gas passes through this choke point. Oil prices could spike potentially by 30 to 50% almost immediately. A closure could spike oil prices by $8 to $31 a barrel, with the risk of surpassing $100 to $150 a barrel if it was prolonged. And then gasoline prices in the U.S. could jump 20 cents to $1 or more per gallon. So the potential could be $5 to $7 a gallon gasoline, depending on the duration of this. Now, in the United States, we have made big strides towards energy independence. That's something that our nation is aware of, right? But the way that I understand things, the economics of oil supply and demand are globally interconnected. So a shortage someplace else could still drive up prices here, even if we're producing all of our own fuel that we need, right?
Oh yeah, the $5 to $7 gallon gas sounds about right for California today. How would you know the difference? I'm sort of joking. It just always seems very expensive when I go there. But you're right. This is it isn't as if life's going to go on as usual, but it probably won't end. That's what I would say. The closing the Persian Gulf, for one thing, closing the Straits of Hormuz is harder to do than it sounds. And I think the Americans, and if they could find some European allies to help, could probably take care of it. But that would be a huge distraction and take resources, political bandwidth, military hardware that we don't have enough of. And China might like to see us get drawn into something like that, although they would be affected as well, unless they could get the Iranians to agree to let their ships go through, which they just might try. But as you said, the effect on oil prices would be immense. And that actually has an effect on things like fertilizer that you use to grow food. And as you said, when you pull on one string in this question, there's a bunch of others that get affected. And you get increase in food. Well, what kind of problems is food prices? What kind of effects that going to have? And yes, maybe we would adjust somehow, but there's other countries where the adjustment may not be so easy, and that's just one thing. And so the cost of everything would go up, and cost isn't everything, but it is a problem. And we saw that, remember, when the semiconductor chips were interrupted during COVID. You saw the ripple effect of that on everything. And that gives you a good idea of just how troublesome these sorts of interruptions can be. The geography of the Persian Gulf is such that there's not really other good ways to get your oil out of the region. It can be done, and sometimes when there's a need, we do adjust. Just as closing off the Red Sea when the Houthis were attacking, shut down the Suez Canal traffic, and well, you'll notice we adjusted to this, but not without some problem. But I think closing off the Straits of Hormuz would probably be a bit bigger deal, to my way of thinking. So not the end of the world, but not something you want to deal with if you can help it. And so one doesn't want to laugh it off. And the U.S. really does benefit from having done so much to get energy independence. Well, we sort of squandered it in the last few years, but we did have it for a brief while. And one thing, if that you note is that the U.S. in particular and the West as well, when we have to adjust, we do, and we do it incredibly quickly. So you would expect us not to just sit still and starve and freeze, but we would try to we would accommodate this, but it would be a huge inconvenience. I would say maybe compare it, say, in say a West Coast example. If you cut off, say, 2 of the bridges across San Francisco Bay, there's ways around it, but you don't want to have to do it if you can. So fortunately, we have that's been 40 years of empirical evidence of where sort of dislocation in the Middle East can take us, to include the Persian Gulf. And it hasn't brought about the end of the world, and we've managed to adjust. But it's not something you'd really want to try.
Well, those are excellent points. One thing that had occurred to me was on Sunday night, President Trump alluded to the possibility of regime change in Iran. Now, if that happened, it might threaten Iran's oil shipments to China, as well as undermine their Belt and Road investments, right? And if the Strait of Hormuz does get closed or they attempt some kind of a blockade, my thinking is that could precipitate intervention by, I believe, the Fifth Fleet, but it could also precipitate some sort of regime change, right? Because it would require perhaps a stronger response. And so I'm wondering if that might also be one of the reasons that China has cooled down some of the rhetoric in terms of support for Iran.
Oh, I think that has to be part of it. They don't ever want to be with a losing horse or bet on a losing horse. They'll bet on every horse in the race, but they don't want, in this case, they have been Iran's biggest trading partner, huge source of political support, and they don't want to get caught. They're pretty far out there, and I think this is a huge concern for them to have all their bets on a regime that might go away, and so you don't want to get, say, sort of too extended. And as I noted, they have been Iran's biggest supporter for a while now, and the whole, and it is that axis that you mentioned, that from China's perspective, that is something that's really valuable for them, as to be able to have the cooperation with Russia, with North Korea, but also, and then you have Iran, but also don't forget Iran's role in South America, where they have been operating with Venezuela to really subvert the region. And China has made huge inroads in Latin America in the last 20 years, to the point it is now the biggest trading partner for just about every country, I think, except Paraguay. And that economic power is political power. And what you're seeing is an effort to surround the U.S. So to take out one piece of this axis, this group of sort of cooperating nations, is something China's concerned about, to put it mildly. They're trying to figure out how to respond. And one aspect that doesn't get talked about much is if there's an alternative to the Belt and Road, and there was some effort that the Israelis, the Indians, and the Europeans had to really create an alternative to the Belt and Road. That this is something that puts China in a very difficult spot. And they need all of the economic sort of oomph and support that they can get, because the nature of their economy really does depend on sort of selling things and getting foreign currency for it.
Well, I'd like to broach another possibility as well. I mean, it is very well documented that China wants to retake Taiwan, and it has other regional and territorial goals that conflict with Western nations. So, some analysts have claimed that China's military buildup over the last decade or so is part of a well timed, very well planned effort to go to war at a time and place of their choosing, right? And so I'm wondering if today's conflict in Iran and China's response to it might threaten their own military ambitions and timeline. My thinking is if they have a plan in place and a schedule and they're doing things according to what they feel is appropriate, Iran acting like a loose cannon might seriously undermine that, right?
I think you're right. They're certainly recalculating. China is serious when they say they're going to take Taiwan, and it's of course important to note that it's not retaking it because China has never controlled, the Chinese communists have never controlled Taiwan. They say retaking, but they've never actually had it. And they do have, that's their objective, and they're dead serious. But the latest in Iran is causing them, I think, to rethink it, not least because it shows the United States is just might go kinetic to defend Taiwan. And I think they didn't quite, the Chinese didn't quite think America would actually shoot. But this latest with the Americans dropping those bombs on Iran, stepping into a conflict, knowing that it could lead to more, might suggest that they have miscalculated America's will, or the American leadership's will. And so that is going to give them some pause. Is another good display of U.S. military capabilities. And despite how good the People's Liberation Army has gotten in recent years, they just might wonder if they could lose their entire fleet in an afternoon. But it is causing a rethinking, but it isn't, I think, enough to cause them to say, well, let's forget about this. But rather, the objective remains the same, just a question of when and how that they would try, to my way of thinking.
Now, another possibility occurs, I guess, mostly in terms of rumors, because I haven't heard hard data on this, but I wanted to float the idea and see what your thoughts were. I have heard that the military and economic strength in China were seriously degraded by the pandemic. And I guess it depends who you talk to, what those figures are. But I know at least a couple of people who have been there who said that China was much more deeply affected by the pandemic than they let the rest of the world know. And so, if that's true, it's entirely possible that they are struggling still due to a loss of key personnel and roles and manufacturing delays and God knows what, right? So, I'm wondering, could China be in a weakened state still and simply trying to avoid any kind of escalation of conflict?
I think they are a lot weaker than they let on. There's always an aspect in the Chinese Communist Party's behavior of sort of fake it till you make it. And it works pretty well because you get lots of Westerners who think, oh, what a great shiny place this is. It's bustling, people are hardworking. So it does work, but they have got huge economic problems. It's not as if they've figured out a way to run an economy that nobody else in the last 5,000 years has figured out. They have just as many problems to deal with as we would. And so, for example, their real estate market has collapsed. That has led to financial problems as well. You've got a huge problem with unemployment, particularly youth unemployment. They don't have enough really consumption. So that's why you have this just export offensive to sell anything they can anywhere because they can't sell it in China. And that you've got these huge dislocations, and that's the nature of these kind of economies, these kinds of regimes, really, that it always gets out of whack, and they are pretty much out of whack, and they remain as dependent on hard currency, basically U.S. dollars, as they've ever been, and that's why they have to export. Without those dollars, they haven't got half the foreign currency that they need to pay for all of the things they need to pay for in dollars. So you choke that flow, and they've got some real difficulties. So it's amazing how far they've come, despite having a currency that is not freely transferable, and that depends on constant inflows into the really from the West, from the United States, from Japan into China to keep them funded. In terms of their effect on their military, that I think is a different question because I know that there's been huge personnel upheaval, which is a nice way of saying purges. There's a lot of key officers just disappearing right and left. But the way I would look at this is I would note that the Chinese communists have always given priority to military. Even when the economy is not so good, the military always gets all the money it needs. It has very clear marching orders. And you look at what they do. If you actually look at the Chinese military, particularly the Navy and the Air Force in operation, and you see two carrier groups operating sort of east of the second island chain, which is way out in, say, think near Guam, sort of east of Japan. To do that and to operate that well shows a degree of capability that one should not dismiss. I think she has got enough control over the military, enough sort of control over his own position, that despite all its problems, I'm still concerned about the Chinese military threat and the political threat that comes with it. But as I say, when you see them out and about, look at what they're doing around Taiwan, in the Pacific, and the growth trend or the improvement trend in that you have to look at it and say, well, that's actually pretty good. For all the problems, I think the military, which they see as the main thing, is getting all the attention that it deserves. It still has lots of problems, make no mistake, because you don't want to overstate it, but we've tended to understate Chinese military capabilities for a long time. So that's sort of how I would see it. But huge economic problems, although we could do a little more to worsen them if we had a mind to. But the military, I think that the development has continued more or less uninterrupted, to my way of thinking, and it is possible to gauge that if you look at the evidence. The Department of Defense puts out an excellent report every year called China Military Power or such like, and it's really well done. It could be better done, as is always the case, but it really gets across in great detail Chinese military development, and it is unfortunately, when you step back, it has been impressive.
Now, is China kind of the biggest wild card in this Iran issue, do you think? I mean, Russia is tied up and relatively drained in terms of the Ukraine war, and North Korea seems to still be the hermit kingdom that they have been calling it for decades. So in terms of this axis of evil, right, this loose alliance of anti-Western interests, I get the impression that, again, they condemned the U.S. strikes, if I understand correctly, but they haven't really said much more than that, right? They are very focused on Ukraine. And again, North Korea has been quiet, and that is kind of status quo for them. So do you see China as kind of the big wild card here?
I think it's a really important piece of the equation. And as noted, they buy 90% of Iran's oil, and that's 20% of Iran's GDP. And they provide cover for, say, U.S. sanctions, UN sanctions on Iran. And that has allowed that Iranian regime to continue to exist. And some U.S. administrations providing tens of billions of dollars to the Iranians and easy backing off and trying to cut a deal with them, that's helped as well. But China has a huge role. If you took them out of it, Iran would really be in trouble. But I wonder, though, if the wild card is not in Washington, in the sense that the U.S. has the power, the leadership to be able to apply maximum pressure on Iran. And they did that in the first Trump administration. It was actually very effective. They got the Europeans to get on board. Even the Chinese had to back off. And as a result, that regime in Iran was tottering. And that is ultimately something, I think, that if you want to succeed, I don't know how you can continue with that regime. It is going to, it's either going to have to transform completely or else just go away. Otherwise, you will just get more Iranian behavior and destabilization in the region and beyond. So I would say it depends. Does the U.S. have the will? I think it is good to offer a nice deal to Iran, but it will require some certain behavioral changes, and then say, look, we've tried, but it isn't working. So it's back to maximum pressure, and this time China is not going to evade those sanctions. They can have a choice: either do business with Iran or do business with the United States. Suspend the People's Bank of China's license to operate in the US dollar system for a year, for starters. Make a total ban on technology exports to China. There's things you have to do if you want to get a result, say, from the PRC, and to have the desired effect on Iran. So I think it would require crushing economic sanctions that are enforced, and once again a military component, if necessary, on the Iranian regime to really have any real change in the region. And the only people who can do that is the United States. So maybe they're the wild card in all of this. Because if you've watched, goodness, 5 or 6 administrations, all but one of which is not wanted to take on Iran, you kind of think that if we don't, who is? And when I say take on Iran, I mean Iran as we've known it in our adult lifetimes. And you get one more example. You had 300 Iranian attacks on U.S. forces in the region, the Middle Eastern region, during the previous administration. There was no response to Iran for any of these. And if that's how we act, well, you don't expect Iran to transform itself. So I think it depends on us. China's a major player, but I think we're the decisive party in this.
Well, I appreciate your saying that. And I want to drive home this point that Iran, they have been a state sponsor of terror. They were designated that back in 1984. They have sponsored Hamas, Hezbollah, many, many different terrorist organizations. They have been involved with all sorts of hostilities against Israel and Western powers, right? They've been attempting to develop nuclear weapons for over 30 years, starting with Project Ahmad. So there are a lot of negative things there. Again, going to this axis of evil, they are supplying drones to Russia for use in Ukraine. And then they are presumably paying for the materials to create those drones with oil sales to China. So these are interconnected countries. Do you think that we might be able to apply pressure to Russia or China potentially and have that help at least pacify Iran without further conflict?
I think that's how you have to do it. And particularly in the case of China, as I said, you give China a choice. Well, is it Iran or us? Which one will it be? And start exposing some of Xi Jinping and the top CCP leadership wealth, which is immense. And it's the one thing that really scares them. So you apply pressure on China to get them to do what we would like them to do. And when it comes to Iran, with the Russians as well, you might take a slightly different approach. But China really is bankrolling the Russians in Ukraine and elsewhere. And I think China kind of enjoys this. It's sort of a turnaround from the Korean War, when the Russians were sort of manipulating the Chinese into doing all the fighting on the Korean Peninsula and, sort of wearing themselves out. And now it's the Chinese who are having the Russians wearing themselves out in Ukraine. So I think they're sort of enjoying that. But you do have to apply pressure on the PRC in particular if you're going to have an effect on Iran. And it remains to be seen if we actually do that.
It's interesting. And again, this loose alliance, in some ways, it seems reminiscent of the Axis during World War II, right? I mean, Italy and Germany, from everything I've read, were not that closely aligned. They had very different political leadership. They had different goals, different ambitions, right? But they were both aligned against Western powers, and so they became fair weather friends. And with Russia, Iran, and China, it seems very much the same way. If I was in Beijing, I would be somewhat terrified of Iran because of their unpredictability, right? And I'm sure that the Russians feel the same way. But that appears to be, that's what they have to work with in terms of an alliance, right?
Yeah. It'd be a little bit, also think of maybe as taking a component out of an engine. Maybe the engine isn't going to work as well if you take it out. And that's where if you can get Iran out of that axis, that they've got some real problems. Your point about the World War II enemies not really having that much in common is well taken. The Germans and the Japanese were, it was a weird sort of connection. It never really worked out all that well. But then look at the British and us and the Russians. I mean, my goodness, this is the Russians that had just murdered 20, 30 million people. And we were glad to join up with them. So you get these strange bedfellows, depending on circumstances. And that's really all it is. But nonetheless, it can cause a lot of trouble as well. And when going back to this nature of the Iranian regime, you'd read off just part of the list of the things they have done since 1980, since they came in 79. One that I would cite, for listeners who just can't quite believe it or that it's all that bad, there was a CIA station chief in Beirut named Bill Buckley who was kidnapped by the Iranians, and they took him back to Iran and tortured him, and they videotaped it all, and they sent those tapes to the Americans, and that is that regime, and this is the most horrific stuff you will see. It's not as if those were other people that did this. And that is what we're dealing with. So I say there's, if that isn't enough to convince someone, I don't know what is. But that's been one instance that has really has stuck with me for a long time. And so this is not just a question of just someone we differ with. These are people that are pretty bad. And there's also an idea here that maybe that's the best the Persians can do. Well, I choose not to believe that Persia, that was a pretty good country, really a great country, not all that long ago. Iran. I think that they can do better than this, and I think that people deserve better than this. So it's been half a century, but that Bill Buckley case is one that is very hard to excuse away.
Yeah, well, and on that second point about, can Persia do better? I mean, the example that comes to my mind, Saudi Arabia would be one example, but definitely Dubai, right? I mean, Dubai is creating a paradise in the desert. And I realize they do have lots of their own issues that they're trying to deal with, but it is a tiny little country, right? And they are making news headlines for positive things on a daily basis. And so if a country like Dubai can do it, then, what could Iran do with the vast oil reserves and land and I think 70-something million people that they have in their population? So, there is so much there that they could be doing in a positive way. And hopefully over time, they will be able to resolve some of their hostilities and move towards being an active, positive member of, the world order, so to speak.
No reason they can't. You think of how many countries that it was always said, well, they're just always going to be like this. I would say Taiwan, which was basically a military government until the late 80s. And the idea was, well, that's all it will ever be. It has to be. They have to have a tough government, no real individual liberties. Well, they had a leader, it was Chiang Kai-shek's son, who said, no, we're going to do something different. And it now turned into a really nice example of a consensual liberal democracy run by people who were of Chinese origins. And it's an embarrassment, I think, if you look across the strait. So it wouldn't be the first time that a country, you can see it can be run differently. So one would like to see that happen. It used to be said for South Africa for many years, well, it has to be an apartheid system. It just has to be, run by a sort of a tough, so almost a police state that said there's no other option. Well, it turned out there was. They haven't handled it very well since, but for a little while it did show what can be done. So there's nothing written in stone that says that Iran has to be a country like we've seen it for the last 45 years.
Yeah. Well, actually, China came to mind, right? I mean, for all of its many flaws, China, from what I've read, has been able to lift something like 40% of their population out of poverty, right? And so that rapid industrialization over the last few decades has been growth for them. They are at least becoming a highly productive nation right now. I do realize they have geopolitical issues. I realize they have leadership issues that conflict with the West, but it seems like they are, they're no longer the paper tiger, where half the population was starving that people once said.
You still have in China about 600 million people a day, which is getting up to half the population. 600 million people live on $5 a day, and there's more who live on less. Yes, they did bring some large number of people out of abject poverty, but not being funny, but I think all they had to do was stop murdering them and killing them, and let the natural industriousness of the Chinese people kick in. Just give them a slight amount of freedom, and it was just a slight amount. So I don't see that as, to me, it's not really a great accomplishment. The Chinese Communist Party has killed 50 to 60 million Chinese people in peacetime and good weather. And so, but I think, to me, I see it doesn't have to be like that. A really free China that looked like Taiwan. Boy, that would be quite a country. But here you still have black prisons, organ harvesting, concentration camps, a complete one-party state, sort of a surveillance system that George Orwell couldn't have imagined. But I think there's obviously a lot of room for improvement. But the basic idea that a country is stuck in a bad place, I just don't see that. These things do change, and there's no reason they can't. Sometimes they need some help.
Wonderful. Well, Grant, let me thank you so much for your time today. And again, I'm going to refer people to your book, When China Attacks. I'm going to drop that in the show notes. They should definitely learn more about that. I will drop a link into your recent Fox News appearance. And again, congratulations on that. That was exciting to see you on network TV. So let me close by asking, what is coming up in the near future for you? Do you have any more appearances scheduled on mainstream media? And what do you anticipate in terms of this situation with Iran, this tentative ceasefire that's starting to happen, and potentially relations with China, Russia, North Korea?
Goodness. Well, I'll probably just keep doing the same stuff. I've got another book in the works. It's just two. One's about Asian defense, of course. The other's actually a thriller I was asked to write about, tell a good story. About things out in the Pacific. So that'll, once I get set on that, it's going to take some effort. But I do the usual sort of interviewing stuff, always at 2 a.m. in the morning, and do get to DC now and then and speak here and there as well. I always enjoyed talking because you've got, it's fun. What do I see coming with China? I don't see them getting any better. I think we are headed for a showdown at some point. Chinese political warfare continues everywhere, and it's actually very successful. And I think America's finally sort of waking up to defend itself and defending the freedoms that we think are essential. And I think our friends are sort of waking up. It's taking a little time to get them on board, but I think it's I hesitate to say it, but the battle lines are being drawn, and one wishes that by demonstrating we will defend ourselves, that we don't actually go to blows. And I like to think that can be done, but it is going to take some work on our part. In terms of what comes with Iran and that business, I would expect, unfortunately, that wait a week or two, and I think an uneasy stalemate will appear, and the U.S. side, the Israelis, won't quite know how to go about adjusting things. I think they'll almost be frozen in place. You may get some attacks, but is it going to be enough to really change the behavior of the Iranian regime? I'm not so sure about that. So we just might end up with something like what we had before, but with an Iran that is much less able to cause trouble and that's something to keep in mind. That Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, these are on the ropes, or are pretty close to destroyed, and that has really changed the dynamic in the region. The Israelis have done us a favor by doing that. So that's put Iran in a position they can't do it nearly as much as they would have. Wouldn't be surprised if we had something happen in the United States, because the Iranians have gotten people into the country, some of them using Venezuelan papers. So they've got the resources to do something here, cause us trouble. but I don't know that they will just yet. So I'm afraid that the peace is perhaps not entirely imminent in the region, but the same, we're probably better off than we were 2 weeks ago. But one hopes, and we'll see how this turns out.
Grant, let me thank you again so much for your time today, sir.
Oh, pleasure. I always enjoy it. It's always a fun conversation.